I have a reading that comes from a little book called Becoming, which is, it has just a lot of interesting things. And there's a reading by Anais Nin. We do not grow absolutely chronologically. We grow sometimes in one dimension and not in another unevenly. We grow partially. We are relative. We are mature in one realm, childish in another. The past, present, and future mingle and pull us backward, forward, or fix us in the present. We are made of layers, cells, constellations. And I like that reading because it feels like we are building this history together. But then there was a second reading in here that kind of tickled me. It's from Stephen Colbert. It says, "There's an old saying about those who forget history. I don't remember it, but it's good." So I invite you now to share. Let's start with going back as far as the when we built the building on Winton Road, because I know there are some people like Jean Weaver and Dave and Sue Schwartz, and imagine others who remember when that happened. So if you remember the building being built on Winton Road, I did start recording, but it's going. Anne Perry has her hand up. Go ahead, Anne. And you have to unmute your own self. Okay.
So many of you know my dad was the minister when we were kicked out of the old building and spent some years in Dryden Theater and Hutchison House. And then eventually bought the property and built the building. So one of my memories is, we lived in a manse, a parish house, a parsonage. So the church owned the house. And some people took that literally. So one of my memories from that time period was meetings, committee meetings, board meetings, whatever kind of meetings happened in our house. Which I'm sure most people thought that was perfectly fine, but it was a little difficult for a teenager, as I was at the time, and as someone who could not stand the smell of cigarette smoke. And no matter how many times I kept my door closed, it just filtered upstairs. So I was extremely glad when the building opened. And there was then space for all those meetings and all that took place. I think that's one of the most difficult times in a church when you don't have a home and you have to figure out where to buy property and who to hire to be your architect. And, we have a lot of gratefulness to Jean France, who helped with that process. But that's a hard time in the church. And one of the results of that is my dad went back to Canada. So in the middle of my junior year, my dad went back to Canada. So fortunately, Helen Eichler, who was a church member, many of you will remember her, was also the psychologist at East High School, and she figured out how I could graduate that year. So I'm very grateful to her for that. I'll just leave it right there.
Jean Weaver. You need to unmute yourself, Jean. You figured out how to raise your hand.
Unmute.
There
Am I
you go.
unmuted now? Yeah, I think that we were working against each other. Does it work that if you unmute?
No, I can't unmute you. I was just saying ask to unmute, so go ahead.
Yes, I remember Dr. Jenkins, and it was a very difficult time in our history. And I have often thought that we would have to be, it was to be accepted by the congregation and everyone after following David Rees Williams, you'd have to be God. I mean, you really have to be extraordinary. And I think that's one reason why they've gone to the 3-year interim minister, which is such a sensible idea, because there's so much feeling about the preceding minister that it's very, very difficult time for the one that gets you through the next time period. And I also wanted to say something about Jean France and how important she was, and Jim Cunningham. Jim was really the one that knew of Kahn, and Jean had never heard of him before. And but she had the architectural background, and she recognized that there were 3 people on this committee, Jim and Jean, and I don't remember who the other one was, but he knew him from Philadelphia, and Jim recommended him, and Jean saw immediately his value, and I think we owe an enormous debt to her for having selected Louis, helped select Louis Kahn as our architect. At the time, he was unknown, relatively speaking. He was always appreciated by students, and he really started in architecture, the Philadelphia school. He was fascinating. I can talk about Louis Kahn. I think one of my great pleasures in life was that I knew Louis Kahn, and I was there when he came, and I would remember him explaining his ideas to us. He was a short man with white hair, twinkly eyes. Jim Cunningham's kids called him the King of the Elves. And when he walked in the room, this little guy that looked disheveled with the bow tie, and he looked really like not much, but he just had a commanding presence, and you knew you were in the presence of someone great. And so I remember him in the church trying to explain to us about how he arrived at the design of the church. And on an easel was a drawing pad, and he made his famous, circle with the question in the center and the ambulatory from which he built the design. And I always loved hearing him talk, but I never could understand what he said, because he was so philosophical, and he had his own, I read his own language, I think, or I don't know why I think others couldn't either. I mean, we were mesmerized by what he was saying, but to try to express it after of what he was trying to accomplish in the building was very difficult. And so I went back to some papers that I had, and I came across Progressive Architecture, April 1961 edition. And this is what he said. If I were to define architecture in a word, I would say that architecture is the thoughtful making of spaces. It is a creating of spaces that evokes a feeling of use, spaces which form themselves into a harmony good for the use to which the building is to be put. And that's what he did. And one of the things is he always said that he had to do this. It was his job to do the design, but it was our job to tell him what we needed, but not specifically, sort of in an amorphous way of trying to understand what Unitarians believed. Of course, it was the question, and that was the basic idea. Also, so one of the things I got a kick out of in reading this was Kahn's basic aim, therefore, is to achieve in his building spaces that are expressive of the use to which they will be put, and that will evoke an emotional response in those who enter them. Well, many people who enter really just don't understand the building at all. You know, I've heard some really terrible things about it, but I think that's because they were expecting to have, you know, a white church with stained glass windows. But when you really think about what he said, he accomplished it. The fact, I think to me, he was saying, I am designing this building as a space that you can be in, and you can become all that you believe, and you can experiment, and you can try different ways. You can be creative. I'm not going to tell you how to be in this building. I'm going to make the space that you can do it in. And when you think about all the things that we do in that building, it is astonishing. And to be able to have the creativity that we even have now is amazing. And you couldn't do that in a church that had pews and icons. You couldn't do that in that, but you can do it in our church. And I think that's a magnificent accomplishment, that it can range from wonderful weddings to memorial services to the New Horizons practicing, the band to social justice. I mean, think of all the things that we've done. And people get more creative all the time. I'm just absolutely amazed. So.
Thank you, Jean. I love the image of the King of the Elves. That's so great.
Yeah.
I never heard that. Colleen and Emily, you have your hand up.
I could understand why he had 3 wives.
Okay, Emily and Colleen have their hand up and need to unmute, and then Jack and Sandy after that.
I have a question.
Okay, go on.
Okay, I have a question. I wondered if he ever mentioned why he decided on having the fireplaces as such, which we really don't use these days to speak of, but why he decided on that. And the reason is, I lived in Fort Worth before we moved up here, and he built a beautiful museum there. Well, as you know, except for the other day, Fort Worth is a very, very warm climate. And throughout that museum and all around it are wonderful fountains of water. And it always impressed me so that for us in this very cold climate, he has fireplaces all through the museum, through the church. And just about the same time, he built the Fort Worth Museum, and it has cool fountains all through the building and around it. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered if he ever mentioned anything about wanting to keep the feeling of warmth in the church. Why he came up with all of those fireplaces.
I don't remember him mentioning anything about that, but I think that he was, of course, very interested in nature and wanted to have light reflected, and who knows what his reasoning was, but I think that, I think you probably hit it, the nail on the head, that in our area, you need heat.
Yeah.
You don't think that it was a request from people in the church to have fireplaces?
You know, we didn't, as I understood it, I don't think we worked that way, that you didn't have requests
Hand
like
is
that.
raised.
I mean, he would have thought, oh, there's Nancy. He would, I think he would, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Okay.
Nancy Cook wants to
Go ahead.
chime in on this conversation.
Just very briefly, he wanted to create a sense of warmth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And it was that sense of warmth that comes from a fireplace and gathering around it that creates
Yeah.
its own community.
Does he mention it anywhere about being why he did it, or other than just doing it?
I can't document that. Perhaps
Okay.
Bill Fugate could, but that is the general understanding that we have been brought, that has been shared with us, that it was a
Yeah.
deliberate, purposeful
Oh yeah.
reason for
Oh,
creating
he-
warmth.
right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jack and Sandy, had you wanted to add something to this?
Yeah, just as as an aside to the fireplace, it's interesting because his great best known buildings are the library in Houston, or the museum rather, the Salk Center,
Oh, it's all institute.
and then his great buildings in India, his government
Yeah.
buildings, all warm places. What I wanted to say, if you spent time with Bifries, you spend time hands-on with Kahn's building. And after enough years, you kind of meld with it. It's an interesting experience working on his materials. I got interested years later in him and the building, and discovered the biography of Kahn and I think the name is You Say to Wood,
No, to brick.
to Brick. And it's not an easy read, at least it wasn't for me. But what I found interesting in his biography is as he goes from building to building, you recognize things that got added to our building. That, oh, I didn't realize where your story came from. Where did he get the idea of that? And he put it in a building. And the mismatching of materials, that was really early. And I would recommend the book. It gives you a feel for him, and he was quite a character, I gather, and the evolution of his architecture. And then you find yourself saying through it, holy cow, I recognize that. It's in our building. And it's kind of a neat feeling.
Yeah. Ruth Myers, go ahead.
Well, as a much newer member of the church, I was never around for when the building was built. But my favorite recollection of it was a visiting minister a few years ago. I can't remember his name. It was when I can't remember, but it was when Reverend Sharp was still there, and he came in and he looked around and he said, you know, I was in your church once before, and I preached here. And he said, I just remember coming in the first time and thinking how lucky it is that they have a gymnasium.
Yes.
And I just thought that, and then he started his sermon, but everybody enjoyed it. And I thought it was a wonderful memory about the building.
Yeah. I wanted to ask Anita to talk a little bit about the parsonage, because Ann Perry brought up the parsonage and living in it, but Anita actually lived in it for a while. Anita, can you unmute yourself? Anita? Can you figure out how to unmute yourself? There you go.
I have a bad throat. I think it's from my second.
Hold it, come a little closer to the computer because we're having trouble hearing you.
I feel like I'm sitting on Jack's lap at this point. I had my second injection the other day, and I have a bad throat, so it is very difficult
Oh,
for me to
okay.
But I will tell all of you about it soon, I hope.
Okay.
But thank you for asking.
All righty. Well, thank you for, we'll get you when you can talk better. So anybody else who has memories of the time when the building was built? Digging the, and I've seen pictures of digging the hole and all of that. But so one of the other things that really seems to stick out for people is the great organ transplant. Now, I wonder how many of you were involved in that. I know Glenn was. Oh, hold on just a sec, because Ann Perry says she has a poem by Lauren Latham on the building. So, Ann, you want to go ahead and read that? And then Ann Teese has a hand up, and Dave Schwartz has a hand up. So first, Ann Perry reading Lauren Latham's poem.
Okay. At the top, it says when this building was opened in 1962, Lauren Latham wrote the following invocation. Our beloved Warren Benson set it to music as The Hearth Within, and from time to time the choir sings it. We are the bricks, pedigreed, masterly aligned, staunch, but quite impersonal, cold and mute on steel and molded sand. We wait for your kind warmth to prove us beautiful. We will disregard your wealth. We will disregard your poverty. We will heed nothing but your pulsing hearts, your minds in quest of truth, your outstretched hands. With these attending, we will glow as no simple bricks of straw and clay, but as proud particles of a God's house you have contrived to hope for. Bring hate, deceit, smugness, and 100 other ancient illnesses, but for excoriation and not for use. Bring love, bring faith, bring youth, bring age, bring memories and new vision, bring wisdom. Your dreams will stir the magic of the hearth within. We are the bricks, pedigreed, masterly aligned, mute and cold on steel and molded sand. We wait for your kind warmth to prove us beautiful.
Oh, he was our poet laureate for quite a while. I'm so glad you had that. Thank you. So Ann Teese, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question. I heard something about when the church land was being considered, and I guess I'd like to hear somebody tell the story again. And what I heard was somebody noticed that the land was available on the church land and decided that this was where we should build the church. And they went ahead and, sort of made, put money down or something or other. And very quickly, and then they got everyone else's on board. And I guess I'd like to hear that story again, if that is
So
correct.
I'm wondering, Dave Schwartz, since you already have your hand up, and Jack, I see that you have your hand up. So Dave, go ahead and tell us what you remember.
I was not around at the time they selected the property, but I do remember the instance that you were just talking about. And I think it was the guy that was the president of the congregation at the time. Somebody knows whose that is. I can't think of his name right now. I think he was the one that decided to put the money down and reserve this piece of land. But it was a very wise thing, of course, and it turned out a beautiful location, and it's worked fine. It's close to highways and so forth. So it was.
The neighbors didn't like it at the beginning.
And did you want to add something else, Dave?
Well, I was going to say that while I was president, I guess it was, there was a proposal to build low-income housing on the back of our parcel. And boy, did that raise a big ruckus, not only with the neighbors, but some of the people, members of the congregation. And it turned out that Tom Ryan, who was the mayor at the time, said there weren't enough votes to even bring it up. So it never got brought up, but there was a lot of hard feelings about that whole thing, and the fact that you don't want that sorts of thing in your backyard kind of opinions going on. But that was one of the things that happened on this property. I was just going to mention briefly that my contacts with Lou Kahn were quite extensive, because Dave and Dave Tuttle and I were on the committee that built the addition, and the addition was required just a few years after we opened. And so I worked with Lou and Dave Tuttle on that, and with a few other people too. So, but as Sue pointed out a few minutes ago, the reason we have trouble understanding Lou Kahn is he talks in poetry, but he knows how to do that. And after a while, you sort of figure out what he's probably trying to say, but it's a challenge to listen to him, to say the very least. But that's all I was going to say.
Thank you. Jack and Sandy were waving at me, and then Howie and Mary, and then Joe. Okay, so Jack and Sandy, go ahead. You're muted.
The character you were trying to remember the name of is one of our favorite people that we have known during our lives, and that was Bill Newman.
Yes.
Bill and Marge met during the World War II as graduate students at U of R. And Bill and Ray Wright were a pair at the Eastman School. And Bill was opinionated, I guess you would say. And he told the story to me one day of he was on the site search committee, and they had a site up in the Cobbs Hill area, and the neighbors didn't want a church there. May have not wanted our church. And he was driving on Winton and saw this for sale sign for a lot, and called the number and put his money down on the lot. He was chair of the site search committee. If you knew Bill, Bill made decisions. And I actually had a faculty appointment in his department, and he and I argued a lot. The good thing about Bill is that you could have a knockdown fight with him, and the minute you walked out the door, it was over. it would never come up again and would never bias any of his decisions. He was president of the congregation for a while. Pretty neat guy.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Howie, you're next.
Yes, I was wondering about the financing of the building. How much did the project cost, and did you have a big fund saved up for the moment when you get ready to build, or was it a big fundraising campaign? Was it apparently a wealthy enough congregation to pull it off? Did you have a lot of debt on it, or do it all at once? Curious about that all.
Does anybody know the answer to that?
We had a good sized mortgage on it that one of the friendly banks put out. And of course, a mortgage to a church, is a pretty risky thing. But anyway, we had a mortgage, and we also had some funds from the sale of the church downtown. And there was probably some other funds. Jean, you probably know more about that end of it.
Well, I was going to say the sale of the church downtown, that property was worth a lot of money. That was an important thing. Yeah. I really don't remember having a fundraiser until we had to have the capital campaign for the addition. I remember that. But before, I think that we did pretty well with selling the property downtown. I mean, it was prime property. Xerox wanted it.
I remember the mortgage being paid off when I was president. So
I remember that.
That was a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah, man.
Joe, what would you like to add here? You need to unmute.
Quick question for Dave and Jack, I guess. I heard recently that there was some connection on the purchase of the land, because Bethel being on the other side of the street, that they bought the land together, or somehow there was no, I don't know who told me, but okay. No connection at all, that they went in together, or okay. Because when was Bethel built? Was it not? Nancy has an answer, maybe.
1960s.
Bethel also. I'll mute, I mean.
Nancy, go ahead.
Okay, I can't address the original question, but Louis Kahn came in with wonderful drawings that were 3 times the amount that we had told him we could handle. So he had to go back and revise them. And they were still wonderful drawings, but way out of our range. He had to go back and redraw them. This got to be quite a process, and it wasn't always an easy process. But finally, he came to understand what our limitations were, and then we were able to go forward. But as with any building, there's always additional unanticipated expenses. And while we were doing relatively well, there was a time when it came to the point where we wanted a few extra things that he suggested. We just couldn't do them, to the point where he paid for the wall hangings because he knew they were critical, and we couldn't afford that. So he did it. He paid for them. There were other times, if you asked Joyce Lehman, she would talk about the fact that they would have bake sales because they wanted something else for the church, and it was just outside the budget. So there were bake sales. So with any major construction, there are always a few unanticipated challenges along the way. And maybe Jean can respond to even more of that.
You're right. There were a lot.
Yeah, Jane Tuttle. Go ahead, because I know you've been involved in this, although you weren't even born yet. But
right. Oh, yes, she was.
You need to unmute.
I was 10 years old when the church was dedicated, and I just found the poem that my father wrote on that occasion, and it was read at his memorial service. Our Commitment is Deep by David Tuttle. We celebrate this bursting morning, the freer flight of spirit in the building balanced to serve the needs of all of our people. We celebrate the anticipation of even more jubilant and reverent expression in honest space and light. We celebrate the warming promise of the hearth, the discovery in windows that let us look from inside in, the great gallery doors, the wonderfully expressive brick arches. We praise the very process of architectural conception, of lay participation, of skillful building, yes, of stretching to pay. The stretching leaves us richer. Our commitment is deep.
Yes.
Go, David.
Oh, good.
That's great.
Thank you. Yeah, I have good memories of that time when all of that was, the planning was undergoing, and Louis Kahn came to our house and left some drawings and breaking ground and playing in the mud. It was just a memorable, occasion, and everybody has said how special that building is. So thanks. That's all I've got.
She's got a false background.
Anybody else want to add in on the building? How about the great organ transplant?
Oh, yes.
Oh, Deborah White has her hand up. Go ahead, Deborah.
I just wondered if the original architectural drawings included those tapestries. I'm fascinated that he bought them. But he just figured that something had to be that beautiful to fill the space.
My understanding was that the congregation pushed him a little bit. Probably Jean knows better, but to have those done, and he suggested Jack Lenore Larson, who was a famous weaver. Those are in themselves are classic art. They're artworks. We should take care of them. And they do soften the building a little bit, but I think that the colors that were selected were fascinating because basically the basic colors are red, yellow, and blue, and then the shades of, so it's the spectrum. And I think it works beautifully because when you think about it, you could have use any colors you want in that building because they're all there in the backdrop. And yet it's absolutely simple and plain, which also makes it work. I think one thing I would like to ask, because somebody really wants to understand that building, I think to me the best time is to walk in it when it's empty and just look at the monumentality of it. It shouldn't be compared to churches. It should be compared to the Pantheon, in my opinion, the Pantheon in Rome or the Greek temples. It's that kind of monumental. It will last way longer than we will, I think.
Go ahead.
Yes, pyramids.
Go ahead.
A comment about the tapestries.
Mm-hmm.
As Jean mentioned, they were the color of the spectrum, and light was critical to everything that Louis Kahn did. It was critical. And he didn't want anything on the walls that would be a distraction, like some of the stained glass stories in other churches. That can be a distraction. He didn't want any of that. He wanted our minds to be free and comfortable with what was coming from the pulpit or from our own associations. And so it was a freeing kind of thing that he was putting up there. Beautiful color, but it was freedom.
Yes.
And the light coming in from the towers had significance, right? Mm-hmm. That it was, Jack, go ahead.
I realized, interestingly, we've left out one of the most, I agree with them, Nancy's comment. It is wonderful to be in there in that space when it is empty. I love you all, but I love being in
Right.
it.
Oh, yes.
There is a feeling to the building, and it really is. We've neglected an interesting part of it and what might be amongst the most spectacular parts, and that's what's above us, that cross of concrete.
Oh, yes.
And
Oh, yes.
that came out of one of the Indian government buildings. And the first time he tried it, they told him it couldn't be done. And he told them it could and stood there while they poured it. And there is a technique for pouring concrete so that you can span such distances, and you don't do it quickly. And I remember that from the book, Gene, from You Say to Brick. And that's a whole chapter of when he said it could be done, and the craftsman said it couldn't be done, and he said, I'll show you.
That's the roof in the sanctuary, the ceiling. Because what I remember is when I first came to this church, there was a wading pool, a kiddie wading pool in the center of the sanctuary.
It's a good motivation for doing a fundraiser.
Yes, exactly.
It was pink,
exactly.
I believe.
Can I just add, I think it's just fascinating that we've enjoyed so much spending this hour talking about a building that we all love. And I'm glad we stayed on this topic because, I mean, I'd love to hear about the organ transplant, but we all needed to talk about this.
Yes.
It was important, I think.
Well, I am not surprised that we have spent this whole, I mean, because there's so many memories of this and so many questions for the people who came afterwards. It's like, what is this place? All these concrete blocks and, you know, but I love the build. And I also had this intimate connection with it because Bob and the Bifrag guys spent so much time on the physical part of it, not the aesthetic part, but the, you know, and anyway. And Perry, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
I just wanted to share kind of an amusing story that I learned much later in my life. There was a young architect in Rochester named Duncan Buell. And you know Buell Road, it's that family. Duncan had finally gotten hired by Louis Kahn and was ready to go to Philadelphia. And Louis Kahn sent him to Rochester to be the architect on site during the building of the church. And I met him years later because he lived next door to my niece and her family. And it was wonderful to talk to him about his experience. But I just found that so amusing. Poor guy finally gets the job he wants and he's sent back home.
I hope he got to go to Philadelphia later.
He did. We met him down there.
Good, good. All righty. Well, you know, it's 11 o'clock. And we have spent an hour talking. Barb DeLeo, do you want to say something?
I just want to thank you for, first of all, opening it up as a topic. Number two, recording it, because I think we would have been sad if this had not been recorded. And three, maybe we should think about doing another chunk of our history, you know, at another time. And but chunk it like this, where people can reflect and go back all those things that were shared. I hope people will send a copy to the office for the building file. So thank you. And it was really wonderful to see everybody.
Oh, it is always wonderful. Next week, Ken Buckle is going to talk. He's one of our trustees, and Roberta talked last summer, I think, and she said that he would be a very interesting speaker. He said his life isn't that interesting, but we all know that that's never true, that all of us have lives that are worth talking about. So Ken will talk next week. I encourage you to let me know if you'd like to talk sometime after that. Steve Jacobstein is going to talk in April, but other than that, we have wide open Saturdays. And we will have more of these conversations because it really has been wonderful to have the history. And I love seeing you all on a Saturday morning. And thank you for showing up at 10 o'clock instead of noon. Okay, Ann Perry put a note in saying Rev Sherry donated a TV to be put in the Susan B. Anthony Lounge where pieces like this can be streamed. That would be interesting. And that was for her installation. It was her gift to the church, right? Yeah.
I can sort of comment on that since the history committee sort of instigated the whole concept of the screen that, yeah, it was originally, the idea was originally started as something to take the place of the portraits that were taken down. There was a lot of controversy about all the big pictures being removed. And the history committee felt that it was important to have a way to still remember and honor our forebearers in a non-aggressive way. And there is a movement within the greater Unitarian congregation to do away with a lot of the portraits and, moldering old gray things and stuff, to bring in light and future and present, as opposed to just walking in and being struck with all the good history. I personally feel there needs to be a balance, but and so right now the screen is set up to be kind of a rolling something.
Okay.
But I'm sure that it is going to be large enough that if we wanted to maybe use it to do some of these things, I think it's a great idea to have a big TV type thing that we can broadcast these things on occasionally.
Thanks.
It also might be up to put for other committees to put their 2 cents worth in on, or displays or something that's still in transition. Okay.
So I want to offer thanks to the History Committee for keeping the history of the church. And I love the group together building our history. And thank you, Barb, for encouraging me to record it. I usually don't record when we just have conversations, but this one was very worth recording. And I'm looking at all of your faces and realizing that that it is the multitude of us, not any individual, who will stand out in this. So that's been really lovely, is that we are a collective and a community and a congregation. And I love you all. Have a wonderful rest of your Saturday. I think the rain is letting up. See you next week at 10, and Ken will be talking to us. And if you have any questions, email me or call me, and come again. Bye, everybody.